What if the people who are the least qualified to lead are somehow the ones most likely to end up in charge? Really think about that for a second. Imagine walking into a boardroom or a government chamber and realizing the person with the most authority, the one making the biggest decisions, might actually be the one who deserves that power the least. It's unsettling, but look around. You'll see it everywhere. In politics, in business, in institutions of every kind. The pattern repeats almost like clockwork. Take Richard Nixon, for example. His rise to the top of American politics showed ambition, intelligence, and strategic skill. Yet those same qualities twisted into paranoia, secrecy, and moral compromise, ultimately leading to Watergate and his downfall. The very traits that helped him climb the ladder were the same ones that made him fall off it. And this isn't unique to modern politics. Nearly 500 years ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed the same phenomenon unfolding in Renaissance Italy. He predicted behavior like Nixon's long before it ever happened. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote a line that cuts directly into this problem. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. Meaning, people judge leaders based on what they appear to be, not what they actually are. Most people only see the performance. Very few ever get close enough to see the truth. Machiavelli wasn't encouraging deception. He was simply describing human psychology honestly, and modern research proves he was right. Studies published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology show that people often mistake confidence for competence. We reward the person who sounds certain, even when their actual ability doesn't match their presentation. And that brings us to the uncomfortable reality of today. Leadership systems, across industries and nations, consistently reward traits that should disqualify a person. Narcissism, dishonesty, overconfidence, sometimes outright foolishness. But the story isn't all bleak. Some leaders break this pattern completely and show us what real effectiveness looks like. Before we get there, though, we need to understand the psychological mechanics behind the trap. Machiavelli pointed out that leaders must avoid appearing weak, indecisive, or frivolous. Strong presentation, and often exaggerated confidence, creates the illusion of competence. And in the modern world, narcissistic personalities thrive in exactly that environment. Picture this. You're lost in the woods with a group of strangers. Two people step up to lead. One says, "I think I know the way, but I'm not sure." The other says, "I know exactly where to go. Follow me." Even if the first person is telling the truth and the second is bluffing, most people will follow the confident voice. That instinct is wired into us. A massive meta-analysis in personnel psychology examined over 50 studies and found the same conclusion. The traits that help narcissists get leadership roles are not the same traits that make them good leaders. Narcissistic CEOs consistently generate more volatility, more risk, and more negative market reactions. Want a modern example? Adam Neumann of WeWork. He convinced investors to pump billions into a business that wasn't even stable. His charisma and stunning confidence built a $47 billion valuation, until reality eventually crushed it, and the company collapsed. Humans are drawn to certainty, especially in confusing or chaotic environments. As one psychologist put it, we prefer confidence to accuracy. Machiavelli knew this instinctive bias long before research confirmed it. When he wrote that nothing elevates a leader more than great enterprises, he was acknowledging that the appearance of greatness matters more than genuine capability. But there are exceptions, leaders who climb to the top without narcissism or deception. Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana, is one of the best examples. Instead of building a personality cult, he built stable institutions. Instead of chasing absolute power, he governed with humility, Under his leadership, Botswana transformed from poverty into one of Africa's most stable democracies. His success didn't come from charisma or manipulation. It came from grounded competence. So the question becomes, why do some societies reward narcissists, while others make room for steady, wise leadership? And more importantly, how can we redesign systems to promote the latter? Before we explore that, we need to dig deeper into another Machiavellian insight, one that makes many people uncomfortable: deception. Not the cartoon villain type, but the subtle misdirection leaders use to manage perception. In Machiavelli's view, successful leaders often rely on strategic illusions, not because they're evil, but because humans respond more strongly to appearances than to truth. But deception isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's simply the art of directing attention. And once you understand that, the entire structure of modern leadership becomes clearer. Deception, in Machiavelli's world, wasn't about telling grand lies or building malicious schemes. It was more like the magician's sleight of hand. The audience focuses on the right hand, because that's where the drama is. But the real move is happening quietly in the left. Leaders throughout history have used this exact dynamic. They highlight what they want people to notice, while hiding what they can't afford to expose. Think about modern corporate or political communication. Losses are reframed as strategic investments. Delays become necessary recalibrations. Minor achievements are declared historic progress. Leaders rarely lie outright. They just frame the situation so most people want to interpret it positively. Behavioral economists call this optimism bias, our tendency to see what we hope is true, not what actually is. And leaders who understand this know how to turn it into a tool. For example, when a CEO announces disappointing quarterly numbers, notice how they rarely dwell on the failure. Instead, they highlight the exciting pipeline, the promising long-term strategy, the unexpected headwinds. You're not being deceived with false facts. You're being guided towards certain interpretations. It's subtle, but incredibly effective. Machiavelli described this perfectly when he wrote that the public judges leaders by the outcome, not the path taken. Let a prince win and maintain his state, he said, and the means will always be judged honorable. In other words, success rewrites the narrative. People don't remember the strategy. They remember the result. But here's the twist. Not every leader relies on illusion. Patagonia, under founder Yvon Chouinard, took the opposite approach. Instead of hiding weaknesses, they spotlighted them. They publicly admitted to their environmental impact. They encouraged people not to buy their products unless necessary. And incredibly, this radical transparency made their brand stronger, not weaker. Their revenue soared. Customer loyalty grew beyond industry standards. Their honesty created authenticity, and authenticity created trust. So, if deception can work, and honesty can also work, what determines which one succeeds? It comes down to something Machiavelli understood deeply: self-deception. A leader can mislead the public strategically, but the most dangerous deception happens internally, the moment a leader starts believing his own performance. A 2023 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes found that power increases self-deception by 42%. Leaders begin believing their own narratives. They lose the ability to see their blind spots. And because they believe their illusions, others begin believing them too. The cycle reinforces itself. Machiavelli warned about this. The first sign of a ruler's intelligence, he said, is the quality of the people he surrounds himself with. Smart rulers choose advisors who challenge them. Insecure rulers choose flatterers and fools. And fools, ironically, can help a leader rise faster because they never question him. But once he's in power, they hinder him. A leader surrounded by yes men becomes trapped inside his own illusions. This brings us to a surprising paradox. Sometimes foolishness, or the appearance of foolishness, can become an advantage. In modern politics, this is known as the beer test. Voters often prefer candidates they find relatable, casual, simple, someone they imagine having a beer with, over someone who appears overly intellectual or complex. That preference is rooted in the pratfall effect, a psychological finding that shows competent people become more likable when they show small imperfections or simplicity. George W. Bush illustrates this perfectly. Despite being a Yale graduate with a Harvard MBA, he embraced a folksy, down-to-earth speaking style that made him relatable to millions. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Humans dislike ambiguity. We crave simplicity, even when reality is complex. We want leaders who offer clear, confident answers, even when those answers oversimplify the truth. And organizations often reward that. A Stanford study found CEOs who communicate more simply are 23% more likely to be hired and receive higher initial compensation. But here's the catch. They're also 31% more likely to underperform in complex environments that require nuanced thinking. Once again, Machiavelli predicted this. He said a leader must study the art of war, which wasn't only about military tactics. It was about focusing on the practical, the direct, the concrete. Leaders who admit to complexity often appear indecisive. Those who simplify appear strong. The tragedy is that the truly thoughtful leaders, the ones who see the complexity, often lose the leadership race to those who only act certain. And that brings us to one of the most quoted, most misunderstood lines in The Prince. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. People often twist this into an endorsement of cruelty. It's not. Machiavelli wasn't telling leaders to be monsters. He warned against ruling through hatred. What he meant was that leaders who rely on affection alone end up powerless, because affection is fickle. Fear, understood as respect, discipline, and authority, is more stable. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Studies show individuals in power exhibit reduced mirror neuron activity, meaning their empathy naturally decreases. This isn't malice. It's adaptation. The emotional distance helps leaders make hard decisions without collapsing under the weight of guilt or worry. Think of a surgeon. If a surgeon fully felt the emotional horror of cutting open a human body, they wouldn't be able to operate. They need a certain amount of detachment to save lives. Likewise, leaders need emotional distance to make decisions that cause short-term pain for long-term benefit. Too much empathy can actually paralyze leadership. But again, this doesn't mean empathy is useless. Angela Merkel's leadership during the 2015 refugee crisis is a powerful example of balancing empathy with pragmatism. She welcomed over 1 million refugees, but also implemented practical policies to manage integration and maintain public stability. She wasn't purely empathetic or purely pragmatic. She blended both, which is exactly the kind of wisdom Machiavelli praised, the ability to change one's approach depending on the situation. There's also a counter-philosophy to Machiavelli's realism: servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf's model suggests that leaders who genuinely serve their people create healthier, more effective organizations. Costco is a modern example. Under CEO Jim Sinegal, the company paid higher wages, offered strong benefits, and treated employees with dignity. The result? Exceptionally low turnover and stock performance that outpaced Walmart by 300%. So which works? Machiavelli's hard-edged realism or Greenleaf's servant idealism? The truth is, both. It depends on context. Virtue is not a fixed rule. It's a flexible tool. Machiavelli's central message wasn't be cruel or be deceptive. It was be adaptable. Know how to appear virtuous, but also know when you must act differently. Be compassionate when compassion helps. Be firm when firmness is required. A leader who rigidly sticks to goodness in every situation is just as ineffective as one who rigidly sticks to ruthlessness. This leads us to the deeper issue. Our leadership selection systems consistently reward the performance of leadership, not the substance of it. Modern society often chooses leaders the same way a director casts actors. The person who best plays the role gets the job. But if the role requires genuine skill, like running a country or a company, performance alone won't cut it. Many of the best leaders never reach the top because they don't play the game. They're thoughtful, careful, honest about uncertainty. Meanwhile, those who thrive on attention, confidence, and aggressive self-promotion climb faster. That's how the leadership paradox emerges. The people most eager for power are often the ones least to wield it. Yet some leaders completely break this pattern. Nelson Mandela rose not because he sought power, but because he absolutely did not. Abraham Lincoln was dismissed as awkward, unrefined, even strange. Yet he became one of the greatest leaders in history. These are the outliers who prove that genuine character can rise, but usually only in times of crisis, when performance is no longer enough. Before we move into the solutions, how to redesign leadership systems so they stop rewarding the wrong people, we need to understand one more Machiavellian truth: the gap between appearance and reality. He said a prince does not need to have all the good qualities, but must appear to have them. This wasn't cynicism. It was diagnosis. He saw that societies value perception more than truth. And if perception dominates reality, how do we fix a system built on illusions? That's where we're heading next. If perception drives leadership more than reality, then fixing our leadership systems requires us to rethink how we evaluate people in the first place. Machiavelli's writings weren't instructions for manipulation. They were warnings about how easily humans can be manipulated, and one of his clearest warnings was this: people are drawn to the appearance of virtue more than virtue itself. We judge the performance, not the substance. Think of leadership interviews, political debates, pitch meetings, or job promotions. What do we actually measure? Presentation, confidence, storytelling, charisma, composure. These traits matter, but they're not the same as wisdom, competence, or integrity. A person who can speak smoothly and dominate a room may still be incompetent. Meanwhile, a highly capable leader, someone who thinks deeply before answering, someone who hesitates because they're honest about uncertainty, often gets overlooked. This is why our systems repeatedly elevate narcissists and manipulators. They perform decisiveness, they perform certainty, they perform strength. But the performance collapses once they're in the seat of power, and by then, it's too late. Machiavelli saw this dynamic long before modern psychology gave us data to prove it. He wrote that most people see only the exterior. Only a few see what's underneath. And because the majority has more influence than the minority, perception wins. If a leader appears strong, confident, and committed to great projects, people assume competence, even when none exists. So how do we correct this flaw in human nature? How do we build systems that filter out the performers and lift up the truly capable? Some societies throughout history tried surprising solutions. The Venetian Republic, for example, feared the rise of power-hungry aristocrats. So they created a process for choosing their leader, the Doge. that blended elections with random selection. Why randomness? To prevent any one faction from manipulating the system. Another method used in ancient societies involved forcing leaders to temporarily step down and relinquish power, giving the system a way to reset before corruption took root. In modern times, some companies have copied these ideas without realizing it. One of the most famous examples is Bridgewater Associates, the hedge fund run by Ray Dalio. Their approach is called radical transparency, a culture where employees at every level can critique the boss, challenge decisions, and give anonymous evaluations. Even the CEO isn't exempt. This prevents narcissistic leaders from surrounding themselves with flatterers or eliminating dissenting voices. It makes it extremely difficult for illusion-based leadership to survive. And that's the core of the solution. Systems that make it harder for narcissists and manipulators to perform their way into power. Machiavelli's thinking aligns with modern psychology on this point. If we want stable, effective leadership, we need less emphasis on charisma and more emphasis on track record. Less emphasis on interviews and more emphasis on behavior. Less emphasis on how someone talks and more on how they decide, how they treat people, how they respond under pressure, and how they handle accountability. Here are some of the ways organizations can shift the selection process and avoid rewarding the wrong qualities. 1. Prioritize past behavior over charm. Research consistently shows that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, not interview performance. Machiavelli would agree, look not at what a leader says, but at what he has done. 2. Use trial periods instead of instant promotions. Rather than giving someone permanent authority immediately, leadership roles should begin with probationary periods. During this time, feedback is gathered from all directions, what we now call 360-degree evaluations. This prevents the charismatic performer from locking in power before their true nature is revealed. 3. Separate the power to propose from the power to approve. A leader who controls both becomes dangerously unchecked. Machiavelli warned that power without constraints always corrupts. Splitting authority ensures no one person can dominate the system through manipulation. 4. Assign a formal devil's advocate. Someone whose job is to challenge assumptions, ask uncomfortable questions, and prevent groupthink. Narcissistic leaders hate dissent, but organizations thrive when dissent is protected. 5. Implement term limits and rotate leadership roles. Even the best leaders change when they hold power for too long. Term limits keep power from ossifying and prevent self-deception from becoming irreversible. These reforms reflect a simple truth. Humans are psychologically vulnerable to confident, charismatic, manipulative personalities. But systems can be designed to counter that vulnerability. And this brings us back to Machiavelli's metaphor of the fox and the lion. A leader, he said, must be both. The fox able to detect traps, lies, and manipulation. The lion able to stand firm, inspire respect, and withstand opponents. He never argued that leaders should be pure fox or pure lion. He argued that balance is the key to survival. Leaders must be strategic, but also principled. They must be able to see through deception while maintaining the moral courage to act when necessary. But perhaps the most important insight from Machiavelli isn't about individual leaders at all. It's about the systems that manage them. Because even flawed leaders can still produce good outcomes if the system is well designed. This is why James Madison, one of the architects of the U.S. Constitution, embedded Machiavellian realism into the fabric of American government. If men were angels, he wrote, no government would be necessary. Instead of seeking perfect leaders, the founders created a structure of checks and balances designed to function even with imperfect, self-interested individuals in power. They didn't rely on virtue. They relied on constraints. This is a profoundly Machiavellian solution in the best sense. But here's a twist modern psychology adds to Machiavelli's framework. Leadership effectiveness depends far more on context than character. A leader who thrives in one environment may fail in another. It's not always about who the leader is, but whether their traits fit the moment. Someone who is decisive and bold may succeed during crisis, but struggle during periods of stability. Someone who is empathetic and collaborative may excel in a creative team, but fail in a crisis that demands rapid action. This means the question we ask shouldn't be, what makes a great leader, but what makes a great leader here and now? And once again, that pushes us toward designing adaptable systems rather than hunting for mythical, perfect individuals. After all, we've now explored why leadership often rewards narcissists, liars, and fools. Not because these traits lead to good outcomes, but because they give people unfair advantages in the selection process. Confidence beats competence. Simplicity beats nuance. Charisma beats integrity. Until the moment of truth arrives. And here lies the tragedy Machiavelli understood. The gap between what helps someone win power and what helps someone use power well is wider than most people realize. Yet this doesn't mean we are doomed to keep choosing the wrong people. Patterns can be changed. Systems can be redesigned. The first step? Awareness. Most people still assume leaders rise because they are the best. But once you understand the psychology behind leadership selection, how deeply flawed it is, how easily manipulated it is, you stop being surprised by who reaches powerful positions. And as Machiavelli said, understanding is the first step toward changing your reality. So now that we've dissected the problem, narcissism, manipulation, illusion, self-deception, where do we go next? To the solutions that we, as individuals, can adopt. To the mindset that prevents us from being fooled by appearances. To the psychological tools that help us evaluate leaders more clearly. And to the deeper Machiavellian wisdom that teaches us how to see through the crown and recognize the person beneath it. We'll explore all that next. If we want to stop rewarding the wrong leaders, the shift must begin with us, with how we evaluate confidence, charisma, competence, and morality. Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't that the world rewards vice. It was that the world rewards the appearance of strength, certainty, and virtue more than the reality of those qualities. And unless we learn to see through appearances, we will always be vulnerable to those who manipulate them. So how do we sharpen our perception? First, we must learn to distinguish between genuine confidence and narcissistic self-promotion. True confidence is calm, steady, and doesn't need to be announced. Narcissistic confidence is loud, defensive, and hungry for validation. One is rooted in ability. The other is rooted in insecurity. Most people can't tell the difference, and that's exactly why narcissists rise so quickly. Second, we need to understand when strategic communication becomes manipulation. Every leader uses framing. Every leader tells stories, but manipulation begins when the story replaces the truth, when the leader directs attention away from what matters and toward what flatters them. If a leader always sounds inspiring but never takes responsibility, that's not vision, it's misdirection. Third, we must learn to separate simplicity from clarity. Many leaders win support because they offer simple answers to complicated problems. But simple answers often hide the truth. Clear answers illuminate complexity rather than erasing it. A leader who acknowledges nuance is not weak. They're honest. And honesty requires strength. This brings us to a deeper question. What kind of leader should we aspire to support? Machiavelli never believed in perfect leaders. He believed in aware citizens, people who understand human nature well enough to avoid being blinded by theatrics. When you know what drives deception, you become harder to deceive. When you know why narcissists rise, you stop mistaking arrogance for competence. When you know how appearance shapes perception, you stop worshiping the performance. But Machiavelli also believed in something more: the possibility of leaders who blend realism with integrity. Leaders who understand the darker forces of power without becoming consumed by them. Leaders who use strategy without abandoning principle. He wrote that a truly wise ruler sees the world as it is, flawed, unpredictable, driven by human impulses, and still chooses to act in ways that benefit the collective. That kind of leader is neither naive nor cynical. They are clear-eyed, and the same clarity applies to us. We must become the kind of people who can recognize when a leader is performing virtue instead of practicing it. The kind of people who value substance over spectacle. The kind of people who reward truth, even when it's uncomfortable, instead of rewarding confidence, even when it's hollow. Because in the end, the greatest danger is not that bad leaders exist. It's that societies continue choosing them. And that happens when citizens fail to see through the crown, when they forget that power is a mask. And behind the mask stands a person capable of deception, self-delusion, brilliance, transformation, or all three at once. In the final part, we'll turn to the personal level, how these insights protect you, your judgment, your relationships, your decisions, and how Machiavelli's realism becomes a tool for shaping your own life with clarity and strength. So, what does all of this mean for you, not just as a voter, an employee, or a member of society, but as an individual navigating a world shaped by perception, confidence, and psychological bias? It means that Machiavelli's lessons aren't just about kings and presidents. They're about everyday interactions, about the people you trust, about the people you follow, about the people you allow into positions of influence in your own life. Because the same dynamics that elevate narcissists to national leadership also elevate them into workplaces, friendships, families, and relationships. The world doesn't magically separate psychological manipulation from everyday life. It bleeds into everything unless you learn to see it. The first personal lesson is simple but transformative. Stop assuming the loudest, most confident person is the most capable. Confidence is cheap. Competence is rare. The people worth following are usually the ones who think before they speak, who don't need to dominate a room, who lead through consistency instead of theatrics. The second lesson: value track record over charm. Anyone can sound impressive for an hour. Anyone can perform virtue when eyes are on them. But their history, how they treat people, how they behave under pressure, how they act when there's nothing to gain, that tells the truth. The third lesson: don't confuse empathy with weakness or firmness with cruelty. Many good people secretly believe they must choose between being kind and being strong. Machiavelli disagreed. Real leadership, he argued, requires knowing when to be gentle and when to be uncompromising, not because one is good and the other is bad, but because each serves a different purpose. The fourth lesson: learn to read appearances without being ruled by them. Perception matters, but illusion becomes dangerous when you forget it's an illusion. When you learn to see the difference, manipulative people lose their advantage over you. Their charm stops influencing you. Their confidence stops intimidating you. Their simplistic answers stop persuading you. And finally, the most powerful lesson. Don't wait for the world to change its leadership instincts, change yours. You may not control corporations or governments, but you control the leaders you choose to trust. You control the systems you build in your own life. You control who gets influence over your decisions, your emotions, your direction. Machiavelli's realism isn't meant to make you cynical. It's meant to make you sovereign. Someone who can see the world as it truly is and still navigate it with intelligence, strength, and clarity. Because the ultimate goal isn't just finding better leaders. It's becoming the kind of person who can no longer be fooled by the wrong ones. And when enough people develop that clarity, when enough citizens stop rewarding confidence over competence, charisma over character, the systems do begin to change. Slowly, subtly, but unmistakably.